Good afternoon and welcome to the Society for the Rule of Law's webinar on the impeachment power with Yale Law School professor Keith Whittington, who has written an excellent new book called The Impeachment Power. Just a few minutes before we get started of background and introduction, my name is Greg Nunziata. I am the executive director of the Society for the Rule of Law. If you're not familiar with us, welcome. We are a group of predominantly conservative and libertarian lawyers who are dedicated above all else to the preservation of the rule of law, the Constitution, and American democracy. And we put those principles ahead of our partisan or policy preferences. So we are talking about a very fundamental part of the Constitution today, one of the core or the key checks and balances in our system of checks and balances in impeachment. And that is very much kind of a part reflective of the type of mission that we have and the work that we do. We advance our work through some advocacy, which you can learn more about on our website, and also more academic programming like this. We have events both virtually and in person. The best way to stay on top of all of that is to follow us on X or Blue Sky or LinkedIn, where we post regular updates. We are a membership organization with well over 1,000 members nationwide now. We invite you to become one of them. Our members help support what we do and make all this possible. You do not need to be a lawyer. We have membership options for students, lawyers, folks who work in nonprofits, whatever is comfortable for you. We'd be appreciative of your membership. We have a link now in the chat that will take you to our website to sign up. Our next program after today's will be just next week on Wednesday, a week from tomorrow, and it will be about the Appointments Clause and the Senate's role in advice and consent. We have three great panelists, Andy Craig from the Cato Institute, Ed Whalen from the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and Molly Reynolds from Brookings. At the end of this event, I'm going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. I invite you to submit your questions in the chat, and I will put them to our guest. You don't have to wait till the end. You could put questions in as they occur to you, and they will be on my screen, and I will work them in as soon as I can practically. And that is the end of my intro. And now we will get back to the substance. Professor Keith Whittington is the David Boies Professor of Law at Yale Law School. His really fantastic new book is called The Impeachment Power, the Law, Politics, and Purpose of an Extraordinary Constitutional Tool. I just finished it this morning because I always do my homework at the last minute, but it's really a fantastic read, and it's clearly deeply researched, heavily footnoted, but also written in a tone that's very accessible for generalists and non-lawyers, full of great nuggets of American history and politics. And it's a quick but really informative book. So thank you, Keith, for writing this. It's certainly something I care about. I'm going to use my own privilege to introduce a couple of pieces that I wrote that are relevant here, which we could drop in the chat. And one is called The Case for More Impeachments that I wrote at the Dispatch. And the other one is from Just Security called The Need for a Bipartisan Stand Against the White House Counsel Letter, which is related to the impeachment inquiry of President Trump. So I invite you to read both of those if you get a chance. I may work some of that into this conversation. So back to Keith. If you can just let us introduce us to this book and why you wrote it. How did you get interested in this? I think you say in the introduction that this wasn't just a product of recent controversies. So how did you come to write about impeachment?
No, thanks. I appreciate it. So I initially became interested in impeachments as a consequence of my dissertation research in the early 90s. And so in particular, I was, among other things, interested in instances of Congress and the political branches engaging in constitutional debates on their own terms. And high-profile impeachments, I thought was an interesting area of study, in part because it was an area in which Congress was acting without a net, so it was engaged in fulfilling its own constitutional responsibilities and deliberating on the meaning of the Constitution in a context in which the court was not going to review its work and correct it. And so, how did Congress behave under those kind of circumstances? And I also thought high-profile impeachments were opportunities and moments in which Congress reconsidered fundamental constitutional norms and sometimes dramatically changed constitutional practices through the use of the impeachment power. So the impeachment power is both a tool for changing our understanding of constitutional practices, and also a feature of the Constitution itself had to be understood and deployed. And I thought, well, that was sort of interesting, but like many academic things, something that had maybe limited application to the rest of the world, and probably not something of ongoing relevance and significance to larger debates. And then, surprise to me, impeachments have been a regular feature of my adult life. And so I keep finding myself returning to this topic, and in part thinking about the new kinds of questions that have been arising within these more recent impeachment debates. And so the book, in part, tries to pull together thoughts that have been percolating and developing over the last couple of decades as we've struggled with the impeachment power. It tries to introduce, I think, a bit more of a political science sensibility into this. I'm trained as a political scientist, spent most of my career in the political science department, and so I think of myself as a constitutional scholar, and so essentially concerned with checks and balances more generally. And so the part of the concern of the book is really thinking about the impeachment power as a feature of checks and balances and not simply this legal instrument that we should completely analogize to ordinary criminal court procedures, for example, but rather we should think of it as a kind of political tool designed to solve certain kinds of political problems that might arise within our constitutional system, which also means we should be thinking about in terms of what are alternative tools that are available for solving those constitutional problems and political problems that arise as well. So impeachment may be one thing that we would trot out to remedy certain kinds of problems, but they may not be the only way of remedying those problems. And so we should be thinking about what's the best tool for the job, rather than necessarily thinking simply in terms of, oh, somebody committed impeachable offenses, therefore we must now use the impeachment power because we've triggered that somehow, and now we have an obligation to use it.
It's a really important point, and you come back to it in several different contexts in the book that this is a political process for political problems. And I do think we tend to take an overly legalistic approach to thinking about impeachment and maybe thinking about the Constitution more generally. You know, I think I said at the top that we're a group of mostly lawyers, but it's always been important to me to carry our mission beyond lawyers. I mean, so many, there's questions of legal and illegal and constitutional and unconstitutional, but there's broader concerns about sort of constitutional values and customs, which we're going to get at, I think, in a few different angles here.
Well, the Constitution's far too important to leave to the lawyers.
Exactly. Exactly. You don't want to trust anything important to people who track their lives in 6 minute increments. If you let's take a step back first and say, so what, like, big picture, what is impeachment? Where the heck did we get it from? It seems like it's a funny word and an odd tool. Um,
Yeah, well, it is a funny word, and moreover, oddly, a funny word that even the British, as they were sort of revitalizing the impeachment power in the first place, didn't fully understand themselves either. So the Americans inherit this from British parliamentary practice. Britain had been sort of playing with the impeachment power and developing the impeachment power over the couple of centuries prior to the American Revolution as a consequence of Parliament's ongoing conflicts with the crown, and trying to find mechanisms by which Parliament could check abuses by executive branch officials, ministers of the king, in various kinds of ways. And Parliament eventually reaches for the impeachment power as a crucial tool for doing so. They encounter real frustrations in using that tool, and eventually move beyond it and wind up developing a parliamentary system as a more effective way of checking that kind of executive abuse than what they could do through the impeachment power. But by time of the American Revolution and the constitutional founding in the United States, Britain had not yet moved to a parliamentary system, and so the impeachment power was the tool that was sort of still most visible to the founders as a vehicle by which legislatures can help check executive power abuses. And so, as
Before,
a
before
consequence, when the states are drafting new constitutions during the American Revolution, they all include the impeachment power as a way of checking governors in particular, but also judges and other executive officials in state constitutions. When the founders are rewriting their federal constitution and imagining they're going to create three branches of government, not just one branch of government like the Articles of Confederation had. They also then immediately thought, well, we need an impeachment power to be held by Congress in the case of the possibility of abuses of power by the other two branches of government. In particular, they're thinking of the presidency. So they're particularly concerned that they're going to create this powerful office of the presidency that didn't exist before. They're going to give it for the founding period an extraordinarily long term of office of 4 years, when the norm of the period is 1 year terms of office. And there's a real nervousness about having terms of office longer than 1 year. And so they're thinking if we're going to create this really powerful office and we're going to give them this really long term, we need some kind of mechanism to deal with the possibility that this person might become really dictatorial and abusive in between elections, and we can't wait till the next election to hold them accountable and do something about it. And so the impeachment powers seem like a vehicle for potentially doing that. And they're very worried it's going to have negative consequences for the kind of independence of the executive they want to create. So they're really in this balancing act of how do you create some kind of accountability for the executive and potentially the judiciary as well. But also at the same time, how do we make sure that the accountability is not so great that they just get under the thumb of a legislature and they can remain somewhat independent of the legislature as well. And so they wind up giving us the kind of impeachment power that we now have.
maybe this is not one more question about the British background, and maybe this is not an either or question, but it just might help me thinking about the historic roots of this. Was the impeachment power claimed by Parliament really thought of as a tool of countering the king, or was it thought about as holding accountable subordinate people to the king, favored to the king, whom he would not bring the law to bear against? Was it? And it seems like a slightly different motivation, either checking the monarch or stepping in when the monarch refuses to act, or both.
Well, there's a little bit of both, right? In the sense that Parliament recognizes the king is beyond their reach, and so there's no pretense on the part of Parliament that we can apply the impeachment power to the king himself. Um, and of course, there's a pretense, and it often is a pretense in the British system at this time, that the king's not the one making mistakes; it's the ministers who are the ones making the mistakes, and so we really need to just correct the ministers. And so the impeachment power is aimed at the ministers. It applies to the ministers, but it's ministers that the king is tolerating in various ways. And part of the conflict that arises between Parliament and the king at various points is precisely a concern that the king is in fact protecting these ministers from oversight, that he's not correcting them himself when there are abuses in place, and moreover. Sometimes the king is trying to protect those ministers from the parliament. And so when the parliament's trying to take action against these ministers, including through the impeachment power, the king might step in and prevent parliament from doing that. And so part of the challenge for the British parliament, as they're developing this impeachment power in the first place, is seen as much more of a criminal justice style process, and the British Parliament could in fact impose criminal penalties through the impeachment process. And so when they went after ministers, part of what we of course know still from the nature of separation of powers is the sword is held by the executive branch. So the power to execute judgments is held by the executive branch, and the king would remind Parliament of this in the context of impeachments. And so you can impeach somebody, but I'm the one who actually controls the execution of the implementation of the impeachment, which means any penalties you're imposing, it's up to me as king to actually see those through. And if I don't agree with the kinds of penalties you're imposing as Parliament, I'm just going to refuse to do it. And of course, the US Constitution in part republicanizes that by cutting the president completely out of that process, so that Congress has complete authority control over the impeachment process itself, which means in part it's limited as to what kind of punishments the Senate can impose when it convicts somebody. It can't impose capital punishment on somebody, for example, or imprison them or exile them. But it can remove them from office, and it doesn't require the president to agree if they decide they want to remove somebody from office. They're just removed as soon as the Senate takes that action from a constitutional perspective. So in the British parliamentary context, right, it's part of the battle that Parliament's having with the king. They're developing this kind of tool, but the king was always understood as being beyond the reach of the direct impeachment process itself. And of course, that does not get carried over to the United States, where the president is seen as exactly the person you're most worried about from this perspective. And there's no sensibility in the United States that the president is going to be beyond the reach of accountability. Instead, the recognition in the United States is we will not have a king. We will have a president who is accountable, and he's accountable to the people through elections, and he's accountable to Congress in between elections.
And I think Americans tend to think about impeachment as being about removal, and
Yeah.
that's the reason for it, and that's the scope of it. Um, and that's led to some, I think in the last two presidents who were impeached were in part saved by a view that um, their days were in office were numbered. The more serious impeachment against President Trump came in his final days in office. I recall in the 90s a defense of Clinton being he's term limited. It's going to be over soon. Whatever he's done wrong, what's the point at this point? So first, in the book, you step through some alternative reasons why we might care about impeachment, and kind of what are those, if not just to cut short a tenure in office.
Yeah, so removal is clearly the first and most important thing that you can do through the impeachment process. And it's the thing that the founders are most worried about when they're creating the impeachment power in the first place in the context of the US Constitution, is that they are centrally concerned with this problem of what if you have a president that you need to remove immediately because he's an extraordinary threat to the future of the republic, and he can't wait till the next election. So we need some kind of ability to cut his term short. And so removal is the obvious thing you need to have the ability to do from that perspective. And moreover, it's often the case that removal has been most necessary in the context of federal judges. So most of our impeachments through American history have been of federal judges precisely because they have lifetime appointments. If they don't voluntarily resign, if they're in the midst of some kind of scandal, then there's no other way of removing them except through the impeachment power, unlike, say, cabinet officials, who you could imagine we'd be impeaching all the time as well, if not for the fact that the president can just fire them when they become too problematic. And so we frequently find ourselves removing judges precisely because they can sometimes be stubborn, won't leave office, and there's no other way of getting rid of them. And sometimes you just need to remove people. But I think there are other things you can do with the impeachment power and other reasons to have an impeachment power besides just that. And so among them is the impeachment power as it's initially imagined, both in Britain and as it gets carried over in the United States, is partially a kind of oversight tool. So it's a vehicle for peering into the other branches and creating some transparency about what's happening in those other branches and exposing misdeeds. So it's a vehicle by which Parliament and then later legislatures in the United States could expose corruption and misdeeds by particularly executive branch officials. And so in part, you get these state constitutions, for example, and some of them are quite explicit that you can impeach people after they have left offices. And in part, if you have a system of one-year terms, you can imagine why that's true. So you get a governor who's only in office for a year, and then he leaves office. And then the legislature, which often are not meeting all the time, but instead are meeting for short periods of time, may come into office. The legislature may gather after the governor's already left, but then they realize the governor's engaged in some kind of misconduct while he was there, and the impeachment mechanism becomes a tool by which you expose the fact that the previous governor had behaved very badly. And so one reason to have an impeachment power is as a kind of oversight tool in order to peer into the other branches and expose misconduct. As I said, I was originally interested in impeachments in part because of these very high-profile impeachments. So impeachments of people like President Andrew Johnson or Justice Samuel Chase during the Jeffersonian era, or potentially a President Richard Nixon. And in all those cases, part of what's at stake is not just do we remove this person we think can't be trusted, but also can we send a message to future office holders that what this person has done when they're in office is unacceptable, and future office holders should not behave in the same kind of way. And so partially it's a way of also altering our expectations about political practice and constitutional norms moving forward. And I think that was also an important aspect of the argument in favor of the impeachments, both impeachments of President Trump. For example, that part of the argument is not just this person can no longer be trusted with power and we need to remove them right away. But also, this person has misbehaved in ways we don't want people to continue to do. And so, how do we send a message that this is unacceptable, not only to this president, but also to future presidents who might look on this example and think this is an acceptable way of conducting themselves in the future? And you can do that even without a conviction, for example. So, you can do that through the process of the impeachment itself. You can send that message that we regard this as an impeachable offense, we regard this as unacceptable, and you will pay a very high political price if you engage in this kind of conduct. So maybe you should rethink it. And if you're a future office holder, maybe you should then think twice before you engage in similar kinds of behavior, even if you think you might survive an impeachment attempt, for example. Nonetheless, this is a lesson about the kind of behavior that you should take off the table.
So I think we agree that Congress doesn't lose jurisdiction when
Yeah.
an office holder resigns or completes their term of office. So long as the abuses are that the alleged abuses occur while in office, Congress has jurisdiction. Is that how you
I
view
think
it?
that's right. Although I think there's an easier case to be made about the kind of thing that happened during the second Trump impeachment, which is to say the House impeaches while the office holder is still holding the office. And then the question is, does the Senate lose jurisdiction if that person resigns or leaves office in between the impeachment and the trial? And I think there's a pretty clear textual case to be made, if nothing else. And although I think it satisfies the purpose and other things about the impeachment power, to think that the Senate retains jurisdiction under those circumstances. You can't escape the impeachment trial by resigning, for example, although the Senate might lose interest, the House might lose interest, and think it's not worth pursuing. If the goal was simply to remove the person, mission accomplished, right? And so maybe you might drop it. But I think as a constitutional matter, you don't necessarily lose jurisdiction. I think it is a little more complicated about whether or not the House has authority to initiate an impeachment after somebody else has already left office. The House has not exercised that authority in a straightforward way. I think the Senate it would be very skeptical of that authority. So I think you're likely to lose votes in the Senate just as a practical matter because some senators are going to be very nervous about a House that's pursuing an impeachment under those circumstances. But I try to make the argument in the book. I think we ought to view the House as having that authority as well. That there are circumstances in which, in fact, you would want the House to have that kind of authority. And there's nothing intrinsic about the impeachment power or the text of the Constitution that really indicates that the House does not have the authority to impeach an officer after they have left office. Um, but as you say, it's essential that right what we're talking about are people who held federal office, and what we're talking about is misconduct that they engaged in while they were holding that federal office. So it's not like the House has the kind of jurisdiction to go and impeach people who've never held federal office, for example. That would be clearly an abuse of the scope of the federal impeachment power.
You talk about the sort of the shaming function or the Congress sort of demonstrating through the impeachment process that an official was sort of unfit to hold office. There's also in the Constitution this language about disqualification that you can be
Yeah.
barred from holding office in the future, which clearly a reason to do this after someone's already out of office. But you mentioned something in the book, just sort of briefly, you don't go very deeply into it, that there's a real question about whether that disqualification penalty could be applied to a president. And that
Yeah.
was like, this came up a lot during the Trump matter. A lot of folks thought it was important to disqualify him. Uh, but you argue that that might not have held up even had it happened. Why so?
So I think you could apply the disqualification clause. So I think it's clear enough that so the Constitution specifies that officers are removed immediately upon their conviction, and then also allows the Senate to impose an additional further penalty of disqualification from future federal office. Um, and as the Congress has exercised the impeachment power, their practice has been that the Senate will only consider such an action if the House requests it. So the House has to take the further step of asking the Senate to disqualify someone. And then the Senate has also taken the view that it needs a separate vote. So after the conviction, it has to vote additionally on whether or not to disqualify someone. But then the question is, and so there's no question, I think anyone subject to the impeachment power is also subject to the disqualification clause. And so the Senate can impose disqualification. The question is, what is the set of offices or set of positions that you can be disqualified from holding in the future? And there is an argument that the presidency is not among the offices that the Senate is allowed to disqualify you from holding in the future. So I think it's at least a credible argument. I think it's probably not right at the end of the day. But there is a textualist argument to be made that the way in which the Constitution talks about the presidency, when it means the presidency, it refers specifically to the presidency and just doesn't lump it as part of the larger category of offices of the United States. And the impeachment clause, as it applies to disqualification, talks about offices of the United States, and so maybe the presidency is not one of those offices. I think that's probably inconsistent with how the founders were really thinking about it, but they weren't clear either as a textual matter, nor did they discuss it specifically. And so there's at least a plausible argument to be made that while you could disqualify, for example, President Trump upon his conviction, that the disqualification would not prevent him from necessarily running and winning the presidency for another term.
So let's talk then about what the process looks like briefly, because this came up a fair amount in the Trump matter about kind of what process was due a president. And
Yeah.
the White House counsel that I referred to in my article was a very strong argument from the White House counsel that the Congress was following inappropriate procedures and that the administration was not going to comply with really routine oversight.
Yeah.
So this probably raises multiple questions there, but let's start with what is the process supposed to look like? One of the big points back then was the House has to at least authorize an impeachment committee before anything can start under this clause of the Constitution.
Yeah, so I thought the White House letter was kind of outrageous at the time and wrote some about it then. And part of what the book tries to take up is that question of what kind of process is really due to officials who are targets of impeachment. And I think there are two kinds of questions at stake. One is sort of what's the minimum process is due, sort of what's constitutionally required that's due. And then there's a more robust, I think, question of what would be constitutionally reasonable and appropriate to apply. And that may be actually a slightly different kind of question and answer to raise. So I think from a minimal perspective, what does the Constitution actually require? The answer is not much at all. And so this is entirely a function, I think, of the internal House rules. The House had at various points restricted the authority of their own committees, for example, to engage in investigations, including impeachment investigations, because the House chamber was concerned about controlling its committees. So it didn't want its committees to go rogue and start pursuing expensive investigations, for example. And so it used to require that you get approval from the chamber in order to go engage in these expensive investigations. Congress doesn't do that anymore. Instead, they've now have standing rules that authorize committees to engage in expensive investigations and hire their own staff and the like. And as a consequence, I don't think they need a special authorization vote under existing House rules in order to pursue an impeachment. And there's certainly nothing about either the history of the impeachment power as it's been practiced, nor about the text of the impeachment power that suggests that the House needs to authorize an impeachment inquiry before it can actually pursue one. There have been occasions in which the House, for example, has impeached people directly from the House floor. So there have been no inquiries at all. You could just have an impeachment immediately with no inquiry. Moreover, there have been instances in which the House has impeached somebody and then authorized some committee to go figure out the details about why we're impeaching this person. And please write articles of impeachment that would support the impeachment we just authorized. There's nothing about the impeachment power that suggests you need that kind of elaborate process in order to go through it. There are considerations that may lead you to want to do that, though. So if you're the House, for example, part of what you're trying to do, for example, is build the case that will get you votes in the Senate. So you want to be able to bring the strongest case forward to the Senate as possible in order to try to win a conviction there. And it may be that part of how you build that strong case is by inviting the target of the impeachment to offer their defense. And so you can hear what their defense is. You can then develop a response to that defense. You can begin the process of trying to persuade senators that you're on the right track. And senators may, for example, start thinking, I have real doubts about how strong this impeachment effort is. If you're not even willing to let the people testify in the House, for example, about it. So it may be just as a practical matter, part of the process by which you build a stronger impeachment case is to hear from the person you're trying to impeach. It's also probably good hygiene that if you are, especially in our polarized world where it's very easy to imagine that you think officers of the other party, for example, are abusing power pretty easily. Um, it's probably a good idea to actually hear from them. And so if you're contemplating pursuing impeachment charges, there are lots of circumstances in which maybe you'd like to get their explanation as to what they were doing. And maybe they're going to be persuasive about, no, look, I had a good reason for doing this thing that you think from a distance looks like abuse, but in fact, there's a good rationale for it. I can tell you what that rationale is, and we can make this whole thing go away. And so there are circumstances in which you want to hear from that person. In particular, if you're thinking about a high profile impeachment like an impeachment of the president, it probably is the case that the general public really expects more robust hearings than the case of what we're talking about as a district court judge, for example, who, for example, might have already been convicted in an ordinary criminal process. And you might imagine, look, we can do a pretty expedited process. If what we're talking about is a low level official who's already been convicted in a court of law, and now we're just trying to remove them. You might think the general public's going to be perfectly happy with saying, yeah, let's do an expedited process here. From satisfying the House's own members and the members of the Senate, you could do a pretty expedited process. And certainly from the Senate's perspective and from the Constitution's perspective, you can do a pretty expedited process as well. But I think it's also true that from the purposes of the impeachment power, and it's worth highlighting, right, that there are circumstances where you might need to do an extremely expedited impeachment process, and you don't want to build in a necessity for lots of elaborate process and obstruction in order to do the removal. So imagine you had a president, for example, who was truly beginning behave like a dictator, such that you think we need to remove this person as quickly as possible because they're abusing powers in really dreadful ways. They're threatening the foundations of the republic, right? This is the thing the founders are most concerned about in Philadelphia is that possibility, right? That you've got a president who is becoming a king. And how do you remove this person as quickly as possible in order to prevent them from setting themselves up as a king? Well, what you do not want then is to bake into your process some demand that we're going to have some elaborate procedure with all kinds of mechanisms for obstruction that's going to slow you down as you need to do that. So it's possible that there are circumstances in which you can imagine we might need to impeach somebody within a day. And moreover, we may need to convict and remove them within a day because we have to move very, very quickly under these circumstances and imagining these kind of things. And the constitutional system as designed, I think is flexible enough to allow for that possibility. So again, you have to persuade the members of Congress that that's the circumstance we're in, and we actually need to do it. And you can imagine members of Congress saying, no, wait, we need to slow down because I'm not persuaded yet that we need to do this and we need to do it so quickly. But there are going to be circumstances that you can imagine, and you need a constitutional mechanism to deal with it, in which you say, no, the tanks are rolling in the streets. We need to remove this person right now. And everyone agrees, yes, that's the thing we need to be doing. And so let's get this done. And you could do it through a floor vote on the House and have it done in 5 minutes if necessary under particular circumstances.
Let's try to just, I guess, flesh out or nail down as succinctly as we can, and maybe the answer to this is read the book. But
Always the right answer. So first buy the book and then read the book.
and it's the season of giving, so buy several. And
There you go. Buy several. Why not?
uh, how would you define by your lights what an impeachable offense might be? I think you and I both agree that there are things that may be criminal but not impeachable, maybe not criminal but impeachable. I mean, it's a tough thing for people to get their minds around. It seems to be tough for senators to get their minds around. So how would
Absolutely.
you kind of briefly sketch out what rises I guess the phrase is rises to the level? What
Right.
sort of thing might you consider?
Right. So one way in which the House Practice Manual, for example, characterizes the impeachment process as it's actually been exercised over the course of American history is that impeachable conduct is conduct that's incompatible with the office that somebody occupies. Um, and that's probably about right. And so it certainly is not limited to ordinary criminal offenses, although lawyers who are defending impeached officials who have not committed ordinary crimes frequently will make the claim that if it's not an ordinary crime, it's not an impeachable offense. We saw Bill Clinton make this claim. We saw Donald Trump make this claim. We've seen judges in the past and others make this argument as well. The House has not historically found that a particularly persuasive claim. The Senate has not historically found that to be a particularly persuasive claim. Certainly, it's incompatible with how the founders were thinking about why you need impeachment power in the first place. And so I think the claim that impeachable offenses are limited to ordinary criminal offenses is quite wrong and moreover extremely dangerous because it would insulate misbehaving officials from accountability for things, in fact, they need to be accountable for of exactly the kind of sort that the founders were most concerned with. And then, partially as commentators have pointed out, and including the founders themselves were pointing out at the time, is it's not easy to anticipate all the ways in which somebody might behave in a manner that's dangerous to the future of the republic, and as a consequence, requires their removal from office. So Joseph Story, who was, of course, a very influential Supreme Court justice in the early republic, but also an influential commentator on the Constitution as a scholar, wrote that what we should think of impeachable offenses is including is what he characterizes as political offenses, which are offenses that are threatening to the health of the republic more generally. And moreover, what he emphasized was there's no finite list of what those might be, and it'd be a mistake to even try to draft a finite list of what those things might be, because you have to be ready and flexible to deal with the kinds of abuses that you have not anticipated, but that might arise down the road. Um, it's also worth noting that as we have thought about that, that includes not only, although the central thing we're most concerned about is abuses of office per se, right? So you've abused the powers of the office, and that's part of what Story is thinking about when he's thinking about political offenses as such. That is, things ordinary people can't do, and as a consequence, are not part of ordinary crimes, but they're things you can do if you hold political office. I'm abusing the powers of my office itself. But we can also imagine personal conduct that's inconsistent with and incompatible with continuing to hold the office in various ways. And you can imagine that at the level of judges, for example, and we've had lots of judges that we've had to remove because of their personal conduct and not just how they've abused office more generally, because we think that people who behave in this way in their personal conduct can't be trusted, and it's improper to imagine them holding the office of judge and behaving as a judge. But you can also imagine presidents, for example, behaving in ways in their personal life that's inconsistent with them continuing to hold the office of president, even if it doesn't involve abuse of office. So the extreme example of this, hopefully we will never have to deal with. But imagine a president actually literally murders a private citizen in their private life. It would be incompatible with the nature of the presidency to continue to have a sitting president who is guilty of murder. Even if the murder did not involve the use of their office, they didn't ask SEAL Team 6 to do the murder for them. They just shot somebody themselves. We would say, no, no, that person can be totally removed from office. That's an impeachable offense, even though it doesn't involve an abuse of their official powers. It's not a political offense in that traditional kind of sense. Um, but it is an offense that means that that person is no longer has the kind of character that we would trust to continue to exercise the duties and responsibilities that we've otherwise entrusted them to hold.
So let me ask you then just a couple of specific real world examples for you to consider. Uh, in the late Trump term,
Yeah,
uh, I somewhat flippantly said somewhere in the media that I thought it was perfectly impeachable that he was running around saying the only way I could lose this election is if it were stolen.
yeah.
Just such a failure of stewardship that it was at least arguably impeachable. I saw a couple of commentators this last week say that President Biden should be impeached for pardoning his son, even
Yeah.
though the pardon power is quite broad. Um, what do you make of either of those claims? In the ballpark of reasonable?
So I think in the ballpark of reasonable, I actually think the pardon probably is more impeachable than the Trump rhetoric about subverting the election. Although, of course, the Trump rhetoric about subverting the election was attached to lots of behavior
Yeah.
about subverting the election, and moreover, it ultimately built up to something that was much more substantial. And so, I think at some point in that process, you could easily imagine that Trump has crossed some kind of line in which he was engaged in behavior that was fundamentally too dangerous to allow to continue as a senior office holder of that sort, and he's behaving in ways that are incompatible with the nature of the office. I think that's a hard line to draw, and certainly I can imagine lots of reasons for being extremely reluctant to come to the conclusion the president has actually crossed that line in that kind of context. But I think as a matter of principle, we should want to keep open that possibility that there are going to be circumstances in which you could imagine a president simply through rhetoric, for example, undermining key features of the American Republic in ways that are quite dangerous. So, for example,
The First Amendment would not protect him.
First Amendment, I think that's absolutely right. So there's no First Amendment defense. I would argue there is no First Amendment defense to an impeachment. So, for example, a president might engage in First Amendment protected speech, things that, for example, do not rise to the level of actually being incitement, because we have very tight restrictions on what we count as incitement under First Amendment doctrine, and I think quite properly. So we don't want to make into criminal offenses people encouraging political violence in various ways. But if we had a sitting president who was engaged in things that fell short of calling for violence, short of actual incitement, that could get you thrown in jail under the First Amendment, but was in fact encouraging people to engage in political violence. So, for example, a president who was calling for people to go around shooting corporate CEOs on the street, for example, or shooting members of the other race. It's different than the presidents, for example, or shooting members of minority religions, for example. We quite reasonably would think that person should not continue to be president because they are dangerous. And this is part of what the impeachment power is for, is to remove people who are using their office in ways that are incompatible with the health of the republic and can't be trusted to continue to exercise power in that way, even if in this case they're doing it simply through political rhetoric, for example, and political rhetoric, again, that's not either a function of abusing their office and the official powers of their office, nor is it committing ordinary crimes as such. The Biden pardon example, though, does highlight another important feature of the impeachment power, and part of why we have it, which is to say that Biden's pardon, I think, is fully within the scope of the pardon authority. The pardon authority is extremely broad under the U.S. Constitution, but part of what the impeachment power does is allow Congress to act when presidents abuse their discretionary authority. And so, if a president gives pardons to people that Congress views as an egregious abuse of the pardon power. And there are various reasons. In fact, the founders imagined examples of what that would look like. So, for example, if the president was promising pardons to people or giving pardons to people who are doing his misdeeds on his behalf. And the founders are familiar with that in part from British experience, right? The king could empower ministers to go off and behave in terrible ways and then pardon them for any crimes that they were engaged in. And Parliament's precisely concerned with that kind of thing. And the founders are precisely concerned with saying, we're not going to have that here. If you have a president who's handing out pardons to lickspittles and underlings in order to do his misdeeds for them, then that's a good reason to impeach and remove the president under those circumstances. Likewise, if the president were to abuse other kinds of powers that he has, that are lawful powers of the president, for example, the ability to remove people from office, if he were to fire people simply because for bad and what we might think of as corrupt reasons, although not necessarily criminally corrupt reasons, but personally corrupt reasons, for example, they're incompatible with the health of the republic, that might be a reason to impeach and remove a president under certain circumstances. It's not a question about has he exceeded the scope of his lawful constitutional authority. It's a question of how he's using his lawful constitutional authority. And the impeachment power can get at those things in ways that, for example, the criminal justice process cannot.
Perhaps a few questions coming in, but one of them is about another sort of purported basis for an impeachment, which is gross incompetence. The specific question is about what if we have a president who's grossly incompetent in the midst of a crisis? Can Congress remove in that situation? The founders talk about what maladministration, but maybe gross incompetence in a crisis is somewhat different from maladministration. I don't know.
So I think there's some difficult judgments to be made about sort of that boundary line, right? So part of the reason why the founders did not want to use maladministration, which was a term that was used in some state constitutions, for example, and part of their concern was this term is too encompassing and it will encourage Congress to impeach too much. And what we do not want is a president who is under the thumb of Congress and is constantly threatened with impeachments for mere founders didn't quite talk in this language, but certainly this is the way we've talked about it ever since, is we don't want presidents to be impeached for mere policy disagreements. That's what elections are for. And so if you just disagree with the policy choices the president's making, or even if the president is making mistakes from a policy perspective, right? So he's screwing up. But he's screwing up in sort of ordinary ways. Then the impeachment process is not for that. Those are generally tolerable. They can be corrected in other ways. Again, that's what elections are for. But on the other hand, high crimes and misdemeanors is designed to be encompassing enough to deal with things that are fundamentally threatening to the union. And you might imagine circumstances in which something like gross incompetence would qualify.
Failure
Uh,
to respond to an invasion or in
Failure
some.
to respond to an invasion, for example, even if it's not because you were treasonous, but because you were just so grossly incompetent you can't manage to do it. There is a riot in the Capitol, and you can't get around to actually doing anything about it. That may be a good reason in and of itself to impeach and remove a president, even if you don't think they're doing it for terrible malicious reasons, just because they're too incompetent to do anything else. Or a president who prefers to play golf all the time rather than actually perform the functions of his duties. That'd be a reason to impeach and remove a president under those circumstances. So one of the very first early examples of impeachment in American history was of a district court judge who was prone to giving political rants from the bench. The accusation was he was giving drunken political rants from the bench. His family argued, well, it wasn't so much that he was drunk, it's that he's senile. And so he's just demented. And he can't help it. He's giving these rants from the bench. And moreover, they argued because he's actually senile and suffering from dementia, he actually can't form the kind of ill will that would justify treating him as if he'd committed crimes. And so he should not be regarded as impeachable. And I think Congress, although very reluctant to do it, they tried to convince the family and the Federalist Party to convince this guy to step down and retire. And they wouldn't do it in part because they didn't want to create a vacancy for Thomas Jefferson to fill. Right. So politics very early on said the Federalists were like, we'd rather have a senile judge on the bench than have a Jeffersonian judge on the bench. And so Congress very reluctantly wound up impeaching and removing him. And they would prefer to have done it the other way. But the argument was precisely of it doesn't matter why he's behaving this way. The fact is he's engaging in behavior that is incompatible with him continuing to exercise the powers of this office, and he has to be removed under these circumstances. And I think you could say the same thing with the president, that even if the president, for example, were engaged in behavior that was grossly incompatible with the office, even if he was not necessarily doing it for deeply malicious reasons, it would be a rationale for impeaching and removing a president. Again, it'd be a very high bar. Right. And you have to think carefully about what the particular circumstances are that would justify taking that kind of step. I don't think we want to rule it out as a matter of principle.
Another early impeachment precedent is the precedent of Senator Blount,
Yeah.
right? And I think about this because, again, during the Trump years, Trump often said that, who ought to be impeached is Nancy Pelosi. And there's
Right.
this kind of side conversation about, can you impeach congressmen and senators? If so, why not? Or if not, why not? If so, why?
Yeah, so the argument is you can't, and the claim is because they're not civil officers, and so we understand members of Congress to not be officers, and the specification of the impeachment clause that applies to officers of the United States, and so you can expel members of Congress. So each chamber has its own authority as a chamber to expel a member of the chamber who has misbehaved in various ways. And that's the alternative mechanism to an impeachment power, how you deal with a member of Congress who is behaving in ways that are incompatible with them continuing to occupy that office is you don't need to go through the impeachment power. And in part, you don't have to ask the other chamber, right? So part of the significance of the impeachment power is the House can impeach by itself, but it needs the Senate to agree in order to actually remove somebody. And so if the House wanted to remove a member of the House, they don't need to ask the Senate's permission, which is what you'd have to do if you went through the impeachment process. They can just expel them. And likewise, if the Senate thinks there's a member of the Senate who's misbehaving, they don't need to ask the House's permission, which is what you need to do through the impeachment process. You need the House to initiate the impeachment. The Senate can just expel them. So we have the expulsion process as an alternative that satisfies the needs that the impeachment process might otherwise satisfy. So there's both a structural reason why we don't turn to the impeachment power to do that, and there's a textual reason why you don't
And
turn
then
to
the
the.
Blount matter is the early precedent setting this, right? Because
That's right.
Blount,
And so this came up at the very beginning of the Republic, where Senator Blunt was charged with impeachable offenses. The House did impeach them and brought it to the Senate. And the Senate had an initial debate about do we even have jurisdiction over this case and decided we do not. That he doesn't fall within the scope of the impeachment power. And that's a precedent that the Congress has accepted as correct and binding ever since. And moreover, I think it is the correct understanding of the scope of the constitutional authority of the impeachment power.
we have a viewer asking if you had any reaction to the Mayorkas impeachment and how that fits sort of within precedents and expectations of this power.
Yeah, so it's another one of these impeachments. They almost flew entirely under the radar, right? So not accomplishing at all what you would have wanted to accomplish with the impeachment power. And so I think it emphasizes a few things, right? So partially, it highlights the fact that there are other people subject to the impeachment power than the people we normally think of. You can impeach a cabinet official. They fall within the scope of the impeachment power. We have not had very many, but it can be done if Congress really wants to do it. And moreover, the Mayorkas thing sort of highlights why you might want to do it in the sense that what if you have a president who does not want to just fire a scandal-ridden, incompetent, malevolent, what have you, right? Executive branch official. Instead, they're doing like the King of England was doing, which is I'm going to shelter this person and maybe even implicitly or explicitly approve of what they're doing. Congress has the authority to deal with that person through the impeachment process, and they can remove them if necessary. It has not become necessary very often, but you can imagine it becoming necessary. And part of the House's argument in Mayorkas case was it's necessary here. I think it also, though, highlights the question of alternative remedies. So, right, why would you want to impeach an officer under these kinds of circumstances? What's the political problem you're trying to address? And are there other tools you have available to you that might be more effective at dealing with that political problem? And I think in this case, what the House really wanted to do was highlight what they saw as inadequate implementation of congressional statutes related to border policy. And so Mayorkas was symbolic of the administration under enforcing and inadequately enforcing congressional statutes. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for Congress to be concerned about. And there are circumstances where it might even justify an impeachment. But you might imagine the more effective way of doing that in that context is just through normal oversight hearings. And so what you really want to do is expose how badly behaving the executive branch is and how much of a problem they're creating on the border. And I think the House probably miscalculated by saying we're going to do this through the impeachment process, and they would have been better off just doing it through normal oversight. They probably would have gotten more and better and more favorable attention to the problem if they had done it that way rather than mixing it up with the impeachment power. And certainly the Senate wanted no part of it by the time they got to the Senate. And so I think it was one of those cases where the House reached for a tool that probably was not the right tool for the job, even if as a formal matter, it was within the scope of what they could do. Although I have to admit, in Mayorkas case in particular, the House never, I think, did a very good job of really explaining what the real impeachable offenses were in that case. And so even if you thought theoretically they could have made out the argument, it was pretty badly handled. And so it was, I think, a poor choice politically, and emphasize that if you're a member of Congress, you need to be thinking about the impeachment power politically. You need to be thinking about what are we trying to accomplish here? What's the larger strategic goals? And is this the best way of doing it? And I think it was also poorly done, constitutionally speaking, in the sense of not doing enough to really focus on what's the underlying impeachable offense here and why is this the right tool we ought to be turning to under these kinds of circumstances.
Given the trauma or the high bar of removing a president, I've always often kind of puzzled by why you don't see more efforts to impeach and remove cabinet officers, at least kind of as a by proxy way of punishing the administration for perceived abuse of power or constitutional misdeeds. Um, we are running long, so I've got one more. I've got
Right.
one more audience question that I should have gotten to too before we wrap up, which is how does the Supreme Court's immunity decision play into this whole conversation, and what does it change, if anything?
So I don't think it changes much. So as I said, I think there's a whole range of things. The impeachment power is good for addressing that the ordinary criminal process is not good for addressing. And one of the problems I think that the court was worried about with the presidential immunity decision was it was implicating using the ordinary criminal courts to address what is probably better thought of as abuses of political power in various ways. And so we're going to wind up criminalizing a bunch of political disagreements. And many of those political disagreements are exactly the kind of thing that would be better handled through the impeachment process. So in some ways, I think the best way of reading the presidential immunity case from this perspective, at least for this particular purpose, is as encouraging us to think more about the impeachment process as the right way of addressing some of these kinds of problems and trying to deal with them. It certainly doesn't, I think, and it's one reason to remind ourselves that the impeachment process is not simply reliant upon ordinary criminal charges, because right, you might think that one implication, if you're Alan Dershowitz, you might imagine that one implication of the presidential immunity thing is, well, now that you've said that you can't criminally charge presidents for how they exercise their office, well, that really emphasizes you can't impeach them either. And of course, I think the correct reading is instead just to say, no, the impeachment process is on a completely different track. And the court itself emphasized that in the presidential immunity cases. Say, look, the impeachment process is just on a different track and it's a different set of offenses, and as a consequence, not affected by anything that's happening on that sort of ordinary criminal side of the fence. And just to note your point about the cabinet officials, I think it's also true that if you're any time which Congress is thinking we need to hold a cabinet member in contempt of Congress for the conduct that they're engaged in, and there have been some cabinet members lately where Congress has thought we need to do exactly that, that might be a good moment to think, and maybe we should ratchet that up through impeachment. Because one thing about the contempt of Congress kind of thing is now the way Congress now does it is we're just going to refer to this to the executive branch and see if they'll pursue charges. And the Justice Department says, no, we're not going to pursue those charges. Well, that's exactly the problem that the British Parliament was running into with the king, right? And so it says, will the king please do something about this cabinet member? And the king says, no, I'm not going to do anything about it. So Parliament's thinking we needed to have something that we control ourselves. And the impeachment power is exactly that tool. It's something that you control yourself. You do not have to ask the president's permission. And so if you think you need to hold a cabinet official in contempt, instead of just referring it to the Justice Department for them to ignore, one better response is say, okay, well, this is going to be a good time in which maybe we ought to be thinking about impeaching this person.
Ultimate tool in preserving the balance of powers, as you point out regularly
Absolutely.
in the book. It's really, really fantastic. Invite you to add anything else if I've missed it on impeachment. But before we go, I also want to ask you or invite you to tell us a little bit about the Center for Academic Freedom and Free Speech at Yale, which you're involved with founding. The last time we talked to you on this program, we were talking about academic freedom and free speech. So I'd be remiss not to ask you what you've been up to since on that front.
Yeah, no. So I wear multiple hats from a scholarly perspective, and among the things I'm interested in is academic freedom and free speech. And I've been very pleased that Yale Law School has helped me launch a new Center for Academic Freedom and Free Speech. We're going to be focusing on campus free speech issues broadly, and maybe some free speech issues beyond campus. But the core focus is on campus speech issues, some of which involve faculty speech and sort of academic freedom stuff as such, some of which may be larger free speech issues on campus, including student speech issues and the like. And partially we'll be doing some public programming there of lectures and panels and the like. We're also expecting probably to do some white paper research projects and encouraging some scholarly work on these issues because there's lots of issues these days
And this
that
is
need
broader than just the First Amendment, right? Or
broader than the First Amendment, absolutely. So the First Amendment is certainly part of that, but a lot of it is about what are the kinds of principles and practices that ought to be guiding universities in their own decision making. So if you think about, sort of, for example, private universities, which are mostly beyond the scope of the First Amendment, and they're thinking about what kind of internal policies and practices should we adopt in order to help us advance and satisfy our own mission and expectations. If you're a place like Yale or Princeton or Columbia, for example, what kind of choices should you be making? What kinds of policies and practices should you have in place if you want to help realize the mission of those kinds of institutions? And that's a central concern of what the center is concerned with trying to explore, trying to think through what those best practices are, and try to promulgate and publicize what those best practices are to university officials.
well, thank you so much. We're at the hour. Thank you, Professor Keith Whittington. Really appreciate any chance I get to talk to you. I'm sure everybody in the audience enjoyed it as well. The book again, The Impeachment Power, available on Amazon and other fine bookstores. There's a link in the chat to the book. And just in closing, I'd like to remind you all, we are a membership organization. We invite you to become a member if you enjoy this kind of content. We'd love to have you and would appreciate your support. Our next webinar is next week on the Appointments Clause, Advice and Consent in the Senate. You can follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn for more information about upcoming programming. Thank you all, and happy holidays to you, Keith.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.